We're super pleased to have Fred Turner visit us tonight from the other side of the bay. He's an associate professor of communication at Stanford, but he also holds a courtesy appointment in writing about history there. And at the moment, he's also the director of the the program in science, technology, and society. Professor Turner studied both English and American Lit before doing a PhD in communication at UC San Diego. And in between that, he taught for several years at both Harvard and MIT. Turner is the author of a wide-ranging series of publications, including 3 books, and I think every serious student of the history of technology and media has the second one on their shelf. From counterculture to cyberculture, Stuart Brand, the Whole Earth Network, and the rise of digital utopianism, which came out in 2006. So the most recent work, I think, that he's been doing is the topic of tonight's talk. He has just published a book, again with Chicago, 2013, called The Democratic Surround: Multimedia and American Liberalism from World War II to the Psychedelic 60s. So please join me in welcoming Fred Turner.
Wow, thank you. This is a tremendous turnout. Thank you very much. Thank you to the Center for New Media. Thank you to Gail. Thank you to Greg. Thank you to Megan. Thank you for making it all happen so efficiently. Yay. I'm completely delighted to be here, completely delighted to have the kind of crowd. I don't know, because we are sort of out of space, but we'll dive in and it'll be what it'll be. So, it's my pleasure tonight to take you back to a time that we don't tend to think of as closely connected to our own. I don't know about you, but I was raised on the myth that the American counterculture, especially centered here, was a full-on rebellion against a closed, cold, repressive world of the 1940s and 50s. It turns out that the actual story is quite a bit more complicated than that. And I want to take you back into that story, and I want to show you along the way, I think, some of the roots of the new media world we inhabit today. Just to give you a heads up, I'm going to be talking, if the ideas presented here today intrigue you, this is the promotional part of our evening together. There's a lovely new hardcover out with the University of Chicago Press, which I'll pass around. There's actually a ton of good pictures in here, which I'll refer to but won't have up on the screen. So please feel free to thumb at will, and you can just travel around and eventually come back here. All right, so I'm going to tell a story tonight in about 3 pieces. I'm going to try to talk for about 45 minutes. If you have questions of fact as we go along, please jump in. But if we can leave the more conceptual stuff for later, that would be great. I'll stay as long as we need to answer questions. I'm going to actually start in the present. I'm going to start in the world that we now inhabit, a world of multiple screens. I mean, I can see laptops here. I've got a screen in my pocket. Everybody's got screens. I want to talk about those screens and the modes of subjectivity that they seem to be soliciting from us. And then I want to turn backwards. I want to turn back to a time that I don't think anyone associates with that mode of subjectivity, but it is, in fact, I will argue, its origin. That's World War II. Like you, I found myself in the middle of the night watching television and watching people like Tom Brokaw talk about the greatest generation. World War II was a much richer, better time than they would say, that Tom Brokaw would recognize. It's a time that brings us multimedia for complex reasons which I'll outline. It's also a time in which we turn against fascism, we turn against racism, we turn at the highest levels of government and throughout our society toward, of all things, the embrace of sexual diversity, ethnic diversity, things that are just completely forgotten in our history today. And then when I tell that story, I'm going to walk you up through from World War II and the emergence of multimedia in that period, up through the ways that it traveled to the 1960s. On the one hand, through the propaganda world of the 1950s, and on the other hand, through the art world, particularly through the work of John Cage, Black Mountain College, and the like. And I'm going to argue that that moment set the stage for our time today. So that's where we're headed. Let's start where we are. We inhabit this very peculiar world in which there are screens everywhere. We have computers, we have Facebook, we have phones, we have utterly noxious Google Glass, which Ken has an amazing movie about, which I recommend thoroughly. Ken Goldberg, check it out. That's the second promotional part of the evening. I think that will conclude it. We're in an environment where we're surrounded by screens, and the mode of interaction, when I work with my computer, it feels like it's just me and my friends with this sort of small silver mediating device. But in fact, my modes of interaction, the way that I present myself to my friends, the kinds of connecting that I do with them, even the whole idea of connecting with my friends, straight up business networking ideology. Connect with my friends. friends of my friends, but I think it's... That mode is entirely mediated by corporate sponsors who are relatively invisible on the screen. When we interact with our small-scale devices in these immersive, or at least surround-oriented environments today, we are simultaneously hyper-individualized and engaged in an environment in which the choices that we're making are shaped by a relatively integrated corporate sphere. And it's very hard to see when you're just looking at the screen. When you peer through that screen, when you reach through that screen, there's almost always a company on the other side. So we're in a world where we simultaneously have promises of liberation, mostly from the companies that are selling us the devices, and we have a kind of corporate world behind that offering us the terms for our liberation. The question I want to ask tonight is, how did we get here? Brief digression, just a little context for my work. I've been kind of lost for about 10 years in what I'm starting to think must be the long history of new media. Back in 2006, I published this book, From Counterculture to Cyberculture, and that was a book about Stuart Brand, the folks of the 1960s, and the impact that they had on our visions of network computing as the internet was coming online. And Stuart Brand and his crew formed the whole Earth catalog, the Well, very, very active. They brought us some of the following terms: virtual community, personal computer, electronic frontier. Really an amazingly influential group. Anyhow, I started studying them, and when I was looking at them, I was surprised to see that they had not actually dumped all kinds of material from the 40s and 50s. On the contrary, there in the Whole Earth catalog on page 2 or 3 was a picture of Norbert Wiener, military researcher, computer scientist. There was Buckminster Fuller. There was Erich Fromm. There was Margaret Mead. Now, I had always been told that the generation of 1968 had made its bones by rebelling against the generation of 1948. And I was really surprised to see that that wasn't the case, and so I started tugging on the threads. After that book was done, I entered a sort of state of deep panic. Those of you who've written books will feel for this. When you finish a big project, you've been alone in a room for 5 years with the book, you have a couple of deep anxieties. One, will anybody ever care about what I did alone in that room for 5 years? I can't tell you how nice it is to see a full room. And then the other thing too is there's a sort of emptiness, and you wonder what you're going to do next. What I did was I started tugging. I started tugging on Erich Fromm. I started tugging on Margaret Mead. And as I started reading their work and then heading into the archives where their work is stored, a whole other world opened up to me, and one that really surprised me. And it's a world in which multimedia seem to offer intellectuals, journalists, politicians a way to produce a kind of democratic society that will stand firm against fascism, stand firm against racism, stand firm against all the forms of cultural narrowness that seem to characterize fascism at the time. Okay, now we're heading back. Let's go back to 1938. America in 1938 was a challenging place in lots of ways. For American intellectuals, American newspaper writers, many American politicians, there was a problem, and the problem was fascism. Germany, Japan, Italy had all recently gone fascist. And the test case that preoccupied most Americans most was Germany. Germany, up until this point, despite World War I, had been held up by American intellectuals as the emblem of European high culture. And so the question was, how is it that a country that brought us Beethoven, that brought us Kant, that brought us philosophy, that brought us poetry, Heinrich Heine, how did that country fall under the sway of this wacky, short, mustachioed, former court and dictator? How did that happen? And there were a lot of speculations. Fewer people than you might think actually wrote about the chaos of the Weimar years. That actually was less common as an interpretation than you might think. A very common interpretation was that Hitler had mastered mass media. And that mass media itself was, by definition, somewhat fascist. And let me lay this out. So, a couple of different things. One theory was that the Germans, the German leadership was actually crazy, like clinically crazy. And they were able to transmit their madness through the radio, through the cinema, through the newspaper, into the minds of the masses. Now remember that, America at this point has had Freud on its mind for about 20 years. This thing called the unconscious feels very new. So one fear is that Hermann Goering is able to somehow send his unconscious to me via these invisible waves. But another fear is that there's something about mass media itself that causes us to enter into the practices on which fascism depends. Mass media is a one-to-many medium in which we all seem to line our senses up in the direction of an invisible leader. And in that process, many Americans feared that we could not help but become unthinking members of a mass. Now, I think you can get a sense of what people thought about media in this period. This is a 1937 picture from the Rural Electrification Administration, and it's about how radio could reach distant homes. But you can see, even as it reaches a distant home, it's not a warm, fuzzy embrace. It's a massively powerful sort of force. Another bit of evidence that's interesting, here's Franklin Roosevelt. One of the things that surprised me as I went back into the 30s was to see Franklin Roosevelt referred to in mainstream publications as the fourth fascist. This is not right-wingers calling him this. They were saying that he had somehow managed to take the radio and through the medium of the fireside chat, find a way to slip into the homes of Americans and turn their attention, turn their feelings toward embracing his vision of a large-scale centralized state, which felt a little bit fascist to some Americans. So that's the fear. The fear is that mass media can somehow turn us into fascists. Nor was that an idle fear at this time. Now, I put up a picture here of British fascists in the 30s. In the book, you'll see some other pictures. Fascism was a live possibility for America in the late 1930s. I did not know, I had not known at all, and maybe you didn't know either, that in 1939, 22,000 Americans rallied in Madison Square Garden in support of fascism. They had a giant banner hanging along the edge saying, "Stop Jewish domination of Christian America." Simply astonishing. You may not have known, I certainly didn't, that after Hitler invaded Poland, 1,000 Americans marched down East 86th Street in the heart of German Jewish New York, carrying swastikas and American flags, and they were not booed. They were not booed. There's a picture of it in the book. That's after Hitler goes into Poland. Father Coughlin, a right-wing demagogue on the radio, had 3.5 million listeners every week, promoted the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which were a proto-Nazi tract. A Gallup poll in 1939 suggested that 70% of his listeners agreed with his pro-fascist views. How many of you have seen a movie by Humphrey Bogart? Oh, come on. Well, this is the interactive portion of our evening. How many of you have seen The Black Legion? Funny how that movie doesn't make it. Was it? You and me. Yeah. Black Legion was made in 1937, and in it, Humphrey Bogart is an American fascist who kills a Polish neighbor. In the immortal words of novelist Sinclair Lewis, there was a terrible fear that it can happen here. There were even, I kid you not, there were Nazi summer camps on Long Island. Camp Siegfried. You could send your child to learn the proper salute. Life magazine covered it. I mean, you haven't lived until you've gone back through magazines and seen American families doing the fascist salute in Long Island. That'd be creepy, no? Okay. My point is that this is a terrible fear. And as the war gets underway, American intellectuals have a problem. How are we going to encourage our people to get into the fight without turning them into fascists? How are we going to build a mode of national morale, a mode of national unity, that can stand up to what looks like the incredible blitzing power of fascism, without at the same time turning ourselves into fascists? Now, one answer in the Roosevelt administration, among his cabinet members, among some other officials who visited with them, was we should imitate the Nazis. This line went something like this: Joseph Goebbels is doing a very effective job. We should do it like he does it, and we will deprogram our citizens later. It's that explicit. It's that explicit. It's incredible. That, fortunately, that's a relatively minority view at the time, but it's a view that is circulating, and so, in part because it is circulating, a group of American intellectuals, journalists, led by Arthur Upham Pope, an art historian in New York. Art historians, take note, you too can lead political movements. Also including Margaret Mead, Gregory Bateson, Gordon Allport, a very eminent psychologist of the period. They gather in New York, and they aim to theorize how it is that we can convince our people to go to war and yet keep them democratic. And when they gather for this discussion, they have a couple of intellectual trajectories that are important to note. The first is the anthropologists in the group are coming out of what was called at the time culture and personality anthropology. They believe that every culture has its own modal personality type, and that families and then later media systems help produce that personality type. So if one thing that they argue is that Germany has gone fascist because there's an authoritarian personality type that's alive in that culture and that has been reinforced by a series of cultural norms. If we're going to produce a democratic American type, we need to identify what that type is, and we need to develop systems that will promote it. And the name for that type in this period is the democratic character or the democratic personality. Many of you who think of media studies will undoubtedly know the authoritarian personality that Adorno publishes in 1950. The authoritarian personality lived alongside another mode of personality that we've forgotten, the democratic personality. The democratic personality was one that was meant to be empathetic, explicitly anti-racist, able to reach out to members of a diverse range of sexual preferences. I mean, I always thought that this was a period of the closet, and it is in some senses, but it's not in others, and it's completely fascinating. And that somehow we wanted to find a way to make ourselves more whole individually, and thereby let ourselves work better together. We wanted to make a democratic mode of unity. So here's Gordon Allport at the time that he was on the Committee for National Morale. And he says this really nicely, and there are two terms up here that are especially important. The first one is the word personality. Now, I was raised to think that the personal became political in the 1960s. That's not true. The personal becomes political right here in World War II. Because in World War II, any number of intellectuals start arguing that what makes Americans different from fascists is their mode of personality, the fact that they have a democratic personality. Moreover, this aligns a whole body of work across a number of institutions in the government to produce this kind of being, this kind of personality. If the personality is a citadel against which the Germans will bash, then we need to strengthen personalities. The second word that's really important here is coordination. In a fascist state, everything is top-down, one-to-many. Just as in fascist media, everything, in this view, is one-to-many, top-down. We need to find a way of organizing Americans that is not top-down, non-hierarchical, that is more egalitarian, more simultaneously individualizing and collectivizing. I hope you're beginning to hear hints of Facebook. Okay, you should be. And so the question was, how do we do that? Now, the members of the Committee for National Morale were excellent social scientists and terrible artists. So they had no idea how to do it. Fortunately for them, in New York at that time, there was a large, well, not large, but a handful, but pretty influential handful, of Bauhaus artists who were refugees from Hitler's Germany. A number of them had come over in 1937, particularly Herbert Bayer, who designed the all-lowercase typeface we associate with the Bauhaus today. He also went on to help found the Aspen Institute, very influential there, and his colleagues were very involved in Black Mountain College, the new Bauhaus in Chicago, very influential group. In any event, in the late 1930s, Bayer, Gropius, a number of others are in New York, and in Bayer's case, they are unemployed. But they need work. And they arrive in New York with a very developed set of theories about how to build multi-image spaces, multimedia environments. In Germany, they had built those in the 1920s to produce what they called at the time the new man, the person who was psychologically integrated enough to resist the craziness of Weimar-era economic collapse. When they got to America, they were more than happy to repurpose that theory for the production of the democratic personality. So they took this Bauhaus design and started using it in the US. And they took actually this particular Bauhaus design. This is something called the diagram of 360 degrees of vision, and it's actually a diagram for a museum display. Now, today, if you were looking for moments of great political change, you might not look to museum display. But in this period, hanging things in this way is enormously meaningful. Until this time, with a number of exceptions which I'm happy to talk about afterwards, most galleries and most museums hung images more or less like these white ones are along the side here. They hung them for eye contact for a one-to-one encounter. You looked, you moved on. Look, move on. The notion that you would surround people with images on the ceiling, on the floor, at people's ankles, was whacked. And the idea that you would give them the ability to choose which images were meaningful to them and from what angles they would come was also itself whacked. The theory that Bayer and his teammates had, you can tell I've been in Silicon Valley, right? That's really something. Bayer would not have thought he had teammates. He and his colleagues believed in a gestaltist model of the mind, not a Freudian model. And in this gestaltist model, it was the responsibility of the personality to knit itself together using the resources of images and sounds and community in the surrounding environment. For Bayer and his colleagues in the 20s, the hope was they could create environments that would give people practice using their senses in this way, and then that would help them be psychologically stronger as they confronted Weimar collapse. In the US, in the late 1930s, they hoped to use that same perceptual strategy to give folks a democratic kind of personality and a democratic kind of morale. The first place they deployed this design for propaganda purposes was actually the Museum of Modern Art in New York. This is an exhibition called The Road to Victory. This is 1942 in the summer. It only runs for 8 weeks, and in those 8 weeks, 80,000 people come to see it. And it's meant to be a kind of road through which you walk through America. Now, again, to us, looking at this, if you look with the same eyes I have, the first thing you might see are these, relatively stereotypical images of Native Americans who are in fact called red men here. You may feel that acutely. The visitors who saw it at the time felt something else. They were astonished by the diversity of the sizes of the images, the fact that they were arrayed in this environmental mode. You have Tojo giggling while Pearl Harbor burns, and a farmer says, well, that war, they asked for it, by God, now they'll get it. For the people who saw the show, it wasn't the individual images that were so powerful. It was the sense of being surrounded by them. And I'll read you just a couple of quotations from critics who were there. This is the New York Times critic. He says, I think no one can see the exhibition without feeling that he is a part of the power of America. It is this inescapable sense of identity, the individual spectator identifying himself with the whole, that makes the event so moving. Hear that language of the individual spectator identifying with the whole. There's a whole, there's an individual, they're not the same, but one can participate in the whole. Here's a critic from the Springfield Sunday Union and Republican. She says, Road to Victory does not mold the visitor's opinions, for that word smacks of the fascist concept of dominating men's minds. This is an experience that is meant to open you to the experience of your own mobility, your own individuality, your own ability to knit yourself into the story of America. Now, again, this is a highly controlled environment. This is not, a wide open space. You can see the road here. This is the maquette for the show. You can walk through it. And I think it's interesting that people at the time experienced this as such a freeing event. It was the event of the summer in New York. 80,000 people is a lot of people for the Museum of Modern Art in 1942. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is what I mean when I say the democratic surround. The democratic surround is a multi-image or multi-sound source or both environment designed to surround an individual in such a way that they practice the modes of perception on which the development of an empathetic, collaborative, tolerant, anti-racist personality depends. And they do that together in these spaces. So, democratic surround, so in the book, right, the first third of the book is about how does this democratic surround form come into being. And after that, I follow it. And I follow it up to the 60s by two routes that would seem to be quite separate, but are in fact overlapping. One is through propaganda expositions. Starting in the 1950s, the American government, the United States Information Agency, constructed a whole series of multimedia environments for the purposes of changing and democratizing the minds of distant others. And at the same time, members of the art world, particularly the New York art world, who occasionally participated in propaganda, but more on that in a moment, were themselves building out an aesthetic of multimedia display, multimedia performance, multimedia environmental thinking that leads through Black Mountain College to the happenings of the 1960s. The happenings and the propaganda worlds are not opposites. So let's go back to Kabul, 1956. Kabul, Afghanistan, this is the Jeshin International Trade Fair. This is the first time we actually deploy a multi-image environment of this kind overseas. You'll notice that that's a geodesic dome designed by Buckminster Fuller, soon to become the preferred housing of commune dwellers everywhere. Still today, a favorite for Burning Man dance halls. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of the story. But in 1956, it's a space into which Afghans can enter, and it's Afghan men because women are not allowed at the show at this time for Afghani reasons. They can see, look at this, multi-image world of America, a world of diversity, variety. They enter this space, they're surrounded by images, by lifelike statues, and in the middle of the whole thing, there's a fake television station, broadcasting studio. So they enter this space. Now, one of the weirdest and best archival moments I ever had happened in regard to this. I was at the National Archives in Maryland, and I found recently declassified documents laying out the United States Information Agency's tactics for these spaces. And it was, I mean, you find that you're just like, so. They said, the document said this, it said, we need to do what a good therapist does. I'm serious, psychotherapist. We need to assess the psychological state of our potential patient population. We need to construct an effective interactive intervention. And then we need to test to see if our intervention has in fact produced a more democratic state of mind, i.e. better health. It's astonishing. So this is the first time that mechanism is tried, and this is what the test looks like. I got this from the guy who designed the show, actually, Jack Macy. So when visitors left the Jeshin Fair, there were Afghan-speaking professors who'd been recruited from the University of Kabul. There were 12 of them. And they showed them these pictures. And they said, based on your time in the show, is your feeling of the show and of America more like this, or like this? And they kept records and sent them back to the US. Now, the man from whom I got these was no longer able to say which emotion was associated with each look, and I certainly can't tell. America. America, what? I don't even want to go down that road. So, this mode of assess the relative political, psychological standing of a people, stage a multimedia intervention, then test to see if it worked, continues across the 1950s and into the 1960s. It peaks in 1959 in the Soviet Union. This is the American National Exhibition in Moscow in 1959. More than 2 million Soviets went to see this show. It came about because Khrushchev was on American television at one point being interviewed, and he slipped up and said, well, if you let us have an exhibition in Manhattan, we'll let you have one in Moscow. Yeah. We were right on that. There was, in fact, a parallel exhibition in Manhattan, largely forgotten but interesting. Large-scale statuary, Lenin, Marx, tractors. I'm being kind of harsh, but it was reasonably popular, but it wasn't like this. So the American National Exhibition in Moscow is also where the kitchen debate took place between Nixon and Khrushchev. It kind of took place over here. As you can see, this too is a giant geodesic dome. It's a glittering golden dome designed by Buckminster Fuller. Really something to behold. All of America's leading corporations, every arm of the state went whole hog for the American National Exhibition. We put sailboats in the pond at the park. We brought over automobiles. And we tracked every interaction the Soviets have with the space that we created. A couple of things to notice about this. First, the media. This is a multi-screen exhibition some of you may have seen before called Glimpses of the USA, designed by Ray and Charles Eames. It was designed to demonstrate that America has a diversity of things, not just one supermarket, but many. At the same time, we didn't know much about the Soviets, they didn't know much about us. At the same time, it was designed on the model set by Herbert Bayer to produce the democratic experience of choice. But notice that the meaning of choice has begun to shift. At the American National Exhibition, we surrounded Soviets not only with images, but with products, with American consumer goods. And by 1959, the formerly anti-racist, formerly pro-sexual diversity politics of the 1940s had melted into this other ideology of choice. one in which consumption and political choice seem to be one thing. I had another archival moment with this, I won't go too deep on it, but I found 3 versions of a planning document in the Museum of Modern Art for this event. The first version was marked confidential, and it said, we want Soviets to experience democratic perception and consumption. The second one was marked secret. It said, we want them to do that so they'll begin to discuss the possibility of democracy. The third was marked top secret, and it said, we want them to do that so that they will overthrow their state, their government. And it's a very explicit project, and it's a really, really interesting one. This is what it looked like as you entered the space. The header up there says, to persuade, surround. Once again, as in the older Herbert Bayer example, people are meant to enter this space and be confronted by more images than they can process at one time. And so be forced into the position of making a choice. Choice being the essential democratic perceptual attribute. We were also a high-tech country. This is the IBM RAMAC computer. IBM sent this out, pre-programmed with the answers to 4,000 questions about America. That's a Russian-speaking translator up there. They ask him the question, and then RAMAC prints out the answer. But what RAMAC is really doing is recording the questions. Yeah. This was an environment that, on the one hand, offered the Soviets the experience of choice and self-making in Herbert Bayer's terms, but was also an environment that was entirely suffused with monitoring. Again, I hope you're beginning to feel Facebook. Okay, seriously. There were about 20 Russian-speaking college students who were there as translators, and the Soviets had their minds blown because these folks could just talk freely to them. But at the end of the day, they were all debriefed. We placed comment books all around the exhibition. All the comments were recorded at the end of the day and reported back to Washington. The Soviets stole consumer goods like nobody's business. A precise count was kept of what was taken, because we wanted to know what they cared about. The great thing for a researcher is that this exhibition was studied within an inch of its life by the USIA, and all the records still exist. So it was an amazing experience. Really, really could see what the security state looked like when it made something beautiful. Speaking of beautiful and the security state, we need to talk about John Cage. The other strand of this story, running from the 40s to the 60s, is a strand that runs through the art world, and very particularly through the work of John Cage and through the work of Black Mountain College. Black Mountain College, you remember, was one of the great arts colleges in American history. It was also a place, according to one of its earliest presidents and founders, John Andrew Rice, where we aim to make democratic citizens. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. Let's talk about John Cage. So, you may know John Cage as the composer probably most infamously of 4:33. 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence, in which a person sits down at a piano, and nothing happens. But that's the point. The point is that you in the audience are meant to hear all of the sounds that are surrounding you, and to integrate those into your own auditory apparatus as a way of freeing yourself from the oppressive hierarchical sounds of ordinary European, Germanic music. Now, that kind of aesthetic, scholars of Cage have argued for a very long time, came about in the 1950s when he had an encounter with a Hindu friend and then later with Buddhism. What's interesting is that Cage scholars haven't spent that much time looking at his work in the 30s and 40s, so that's where I went. And I was surprised to see that in the 1930s and 40s, Cage was both a raging patriot and a collaborator of the new Bauhaus team. It was really interesting, called him a holy Naj, and they taught here at Mills for the whole summer together. He loved that, and then he moved to Chicago in 1941 and spent the entire year in Chicago teaching sound for the new Bauhaus. Sort of a forgotten period. But the part that's really forgotten is his deep allegiance with the patriotic ambitions of this democratic surround. Cage was a draft evader. He told the draft board that he couldn't serve because his wife at the time, he was married to a woman at the time, had a game leg and required being taken care of. I've seen a lot of pictures of the two of them together at that period. Her leg looks pretty good to me. But at the same time, he was very active in recasting his attack on aesthetics in political terms. This is him writing in 1939. He says, "Percussion music is revolution. Sound and rhythm have too long been submissive
to the restrictions of 19th century music. Today, we are fighting for their emancipation. Tomorrow, with electronic music in our ears, we will hear freedom. The conscientious objectors to modern music will, of course, attempt everything in the way of counter-revolution, but never mind, the implicitly American armies of sound would march on. I mention that because I think it's incredibly important to re-anchor Cage's turn toward this surround aesthetic for which he is so famous, not in Eastern mysticism, but rather in this World War II turn, where he was very active. He was in New York in '39 until he went out in '41 to Chicago, came back to New York. He was also very active at Black Mountain College. He did 2 summer sessions there. So in 1948, he and his then partner, Merce Cunningham, the dancer, spent a summer at Black Mountain College before they came back in '52. And in '48, okay, archival reverie number 13. Thumbing through some papers, I found a course schedule for the summer of 1948 if you had been in summer school at Black Mountain College. Guess what you would have been taking? All right. Music with John Cage, dance with Merce Cunningham, painting with Willem de Kooning. It gets better. Architecture with Buckminster Fuller. I mean, summer program much, right? Like that's the best ever. Okay, but the other piece that's been forgotten. So that part's been known to some degree about Black Mountain for a long time. It's really been seen as an epicenter of the art movement. What has been forgotten is that it was also an epicenter of political innovation. The other 2 courses that you would have taken alongside those were, 1, culture and personality theory, taught by an anthropologist, so that you would understand how personality was in fact the center of democratic culture. And the other was basically a course in world federalism, taught by a representative of the United Nations. And for the faculty at Black Mountain, those courses were as important as the arts. John Andrew Rice, the founder of the college, said, or the early president of the college, let's see, let me find John Andrew. Where'd he go? Give me a sec. There it is. He said, the democratic man must be an artist. The integrity, we said, of the democratic man was the integrity of the artist, an integrity of relationship. The integrity of the artist and the integrity of the democratic citizen were the same, and they needed to be produced. They needed to be produced through an art that would surround the individual and cause their rehearsal of those perceptual skills. So these are just some images from Black Mountain. Black Mountain is where Buckminster Fuller actually first erected a working geodesic dome. He had a number of failures there that were pretty funny too. That's Fuller and Merce Cunningham in a play together, and that's John Cage playing the piano. In 1952, this group of folks and some others gathered to produce what was called at the time and is still recognized as the first ever Happen. Now, nobody's really sure what happened there. Yeah, that's a classic, right? And they were sober. So Cage delivered there are a couple of somewhat reliable accounts. They say that Cage lectured from a ladder, Merce Cunningham danced through the audience trailed by a dog, David Tudor, who was a pianist for Cage, played the piano, the poet Charles Olson and the poet M.C. Richards read poetry, and when it was all over, they walked around putting teacups on chairs. So I think we have to ask, under what political and intellectual conditions is that a meaningful thing to do? I mean, seriously, like, why is that so important to them? And why is it so important that we remember it? And I would argue that it was important to them because it created an emblem, a lived experience of their vision of a democratic America. It was not only an aesthetic innovation, it was a deeply political innovation. Now, one brief sideline. I presented this research at a Cage conference in Poland. And to my surprise, 3 generations of Poles came to that conference because for them, this event was a model of what post-Soviet politics could be. I was astonished. Particularly older scholars who had grown up speaking Russian in Poland, going to school learning Russian and Polish, for them this was amazing. One of them even went so far as to stage a recreation of a Cage-like happening featuring his undergraduate students. Because it seemed like they needed to experience what he understood to be democracy. I just wanted to give you a feel for how far this traveled. And it traveled far, but in part because Cage traveled far. So Cage actively participated in a number of overseas exhibitions, most famously in 1958 in Brussels, the World's Fair there. He performed there, and a number of the people in his circle did as well. They were not entirely outside the world of politics. At the same time, the happenings that he and the people he knew created became radically depoliticized. In the late 1950s, Cage moved back to New York, and he taught a series of courses in musical performance to people like Alan Capro, Dick Higgins, the people who would go on to make the happenings of the 1960s in the downtown New York art scene. When he taught those folks, now maybe it wasn't when he taught them, maybe it was when they performed, the anti-racist, gender-diverse, tolerant world of the 1940s began to melt away. One of the things that broke my heart on this project was when I was looking at happenings in the 1960s, I started looking at these pictures from the late 50s, early 60s in New York, and I kept seeing these horrible things. First off, I saw no people of color. I saw men most everywhere, and when I saw women, the women were generally naked under wet sheets. I saw one with a woman who had to stand on stage naked under a wet sheet, her mouth stuffed with vegetables for the entire performance. Yoko Ono, who you may know, made her bones, made her reputation, covering herself in whipped cream and having it licked off by male artists. It was a deeply misogynist world, it was a deeply racist world, and it was supposed to be a liberating experience. My point here, and I go into this in the book in great depth, is that the 1950s saw the depoliticization of an aesthetic that was, when it came into being in the 40s, highly politicized. And that depoliticization is where we arrive in the 1960s. Oh, stop that. Thank you. Here we are at the Riverside Museum in 1966 with a multimedia installation by the US Company and Garrett Stern. Garrett Stern and the US Company would go on to host Stuart Brand to teach him a bunch of tricks, which is how I knew about him. Here, this was an environment meant to give you a sense of your connection to the cosmic forces that surround you. So you were to enter this space and through it feel connected to the invisible mass of humanity. You were all one, as the saying went at the time. This was called at the time a be-in by its makers, and it got picked up by journalists, and it became an incredibly popular phrase. The be-in that this was sort of felt very much like the liberating stuff of the 40s. Here's a picture from a poster for the show. We are all one. We are all one. On the one hand, that's a hippie mantra, right? I will drop acid and I will see the oneness of things. But it's also a World War II liberal mantra. This is the mantra of the United Nations, ladies and gentlemen. Not only your favorite acid heads, but the United Nations. So the notion of a be-in travels far and wide, and it travels here to San Francisco. In January 1967, in Golden Gate Park, thousands of people stream into the park for what is called at the time the first human be-in. And it's also called a gathering of the tribes. You've undoubtedly seen posters for this. The two tribes were an increasingly politicized New Left and an increasingly depoliticized New Communalist wing that hoped to change the world by dropping acid and building a new kind of space. You've probably heard the song, "If you're going to San Francisco, put some flowers in your hair." I won't sing that to you. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Very welcome. But this is the event about which that song was created. Because people from all over the city streamed into Golden Gate Park, each wearing a little something to signify that they were down with this project. And you might think that that's like a great ending for the story, right? We end here, and look, we have produced the liberated, psychologically whole, hyper-individualized, yet collectively gathered Americans that Margaret Mead and her team at the Committee for National Morale wanted to produce. And to some extent, that's right. And to some extent, it's not. So, this is a very painful part of the story for me. On the one hand, this is the Family of Man exhibition at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington in 1955. On the one hand, the democratic surround is a wonderful, engaging alternative to the world of one-to-many media. These people really feel themselves as free. They are flexible, they move in aggregations of their own choosing, they choose whether to look up, down, sideways, they are not forced into conformist modes of interaction. They feel free, and they really feel it. Unfortunately, they feel it within a world whose terms have been set for them. What I love about this picture is not only that it shows these people who all historical records show as describing themselves as feeling extraordinarily free in this space, it also shows the backstage. There is no surround without a backstage. There is no surround without a backstage. And there are people in that backstage. And the people on the front stage can't see them. They can't talk to them. And they don't get to choose what's there. So on the one hand, yeah, we are absolutely in a different space from one in which Hermann Goering can somehow send his madness down to us via one-to-many media. But we are also now, I think, in this moment, witnessing the birth of the managerial mode of media power that haunts us today. And that's where we live now. This is actually, this is a 2010 Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. This is a direct copy of a multimedia environment from 1970 at the Osaka World's Fair that was itself built around Herbert Bayer's ideas. This is where we live. We live in a world where we are, on the one hand, hyper-individualized, free to move as we like, but free to move as we like within environments whose images and sounds are shaped, selected, and delivered to us and for us by others with whom we have very little power to negotiate. Thank you. Questions? Happy to field any and all. Go for it.
This was great. If the United States in the 30s was on the brink of fascism, there was a way in which it was also on the brink of socialism. And I wonder if the democratic surround sort of emerges in response to that sort of material inequality. And we see sort of the re-emergence in a similar moment now.
So you're onto something I think is really, really important. And I think that one interpretation of this story that I've had, and I don't know how I feel about it, is that the democratic surround emerges in the 40s because of the failure of the left in the 30s to actually take kind of aesthetic and political power. And that this is sort of a third way kind of solution, right? Like it feels political, but it still opens the door to consumption and democracy in ways that are accessible to the mainstream. I kind of buy that. I certainly buy that in our own moment. I think that makes a lot of sense. At the same time, I think that for reasons having to do with our own self-identity in the academy, particularly scholars who are about 20 years older than I am, I'm 53, for scholars who came of age during the 1960s, and who wanted to write a history of their period as an alternative to the 40s and 50s, and as the bringing back of the radical 1930s, I think they've overestimated the radicalism of the 1930s. And I think they've dramatically underestimated the radicalness of the 40s and 50s. Even in places that aren't supposed to be radical. So one of the things that I did was I read a declassified set of arguments happening within the United States Information Agency in the mid-50s. There were people on from every political side in that space. I always thought governments, particularly in the Cold War, were monolithic, sort of one kind. Not at all. Those guys are arguing with each other all the time about how they ought to behave, what they ought to do. And I think that complexity has disappeared as we've told ourselves a now habitual story that we were once radical. In World War II and the Cold War, we became unradical until we freed ourselves in the 60s again. I think that story has misled us. And then it leaves us, that story leaves us unable to put our finger on the thing that you just put your finger on, which is this turn, the turn to sort of a managerial middle again, that feels radical, that looks cool, that comes with all kinds of good hipster vibes, excellent coffee, but that is in fact a return to a highly managed life. Yeah, in the back of the check. Yeah.
I really like your comment about the notion that every surround has a backstage. So I would also wonder if every illusion has a backstage. And the democratic move that happened for me in your talk was where the camera goes up and reveals that backstage.
Yeah,
what do you think our chances are right now of still lifting the camera up and looking down into the backstage?
What a great question. Thank you. Wow. Oh boy. Ironically, I think our chances are better in the state space than they are in the corporate space.
Yep.
I think that we're going to have more Edward Snowdens than we are likely to have an Edward Snowden from Facebook or an Edward Snowden from Google. And I think that's too bad. And I think I'm not sure why that is, except that, well, there's an awful lot of work done inside those firms to channel the energies of their members. That's what I would like to see. What I would like to see is some whistleblowers coming out of those firms. I think we're more likely to see whistleblowers coming out of the state side of it for a while. And I think that's how it's got to happen. We also live in a time, unlike some of the years I've talked about here, where our journalism industry is emasculated beyond all telling. And right now, our reporters are not doing any of the digging that they need to be doing in these spaces. I feel a lot of journalists coming to Silicon Valley, and the Europeans are asking a lot of critical questions right now, and they're sending over investigative teams to do some fairly hard-hitting pieces. I've yet to meet an American crew willing to take that on. And so my hope is that will change. I wish I had a more optimistic answer. It's a really important question. In the way back.
Does your story somehow include Vannevar Bush, who reportedly dreamed up hypertext as, I think, presidential science advisor?
Yep. So this story doesn't. The counterculture book does. So the book that follows this takes up the cybernetics story directly. Because I had spent so much time on cybernetics in the last book, I kind of ducked it here. I will only note that the members of the Committee for National Morale were in many cases social acquaintances, at the very least, sometimes more, from Vannevar Bush. So those worlds overlap, but I take up the overlap in the next book. Thanks. Great. Buy the pair.
Hi, I haven't read the new book, and perhaps my answers can be found there. But I was wondering if you could say more about the anti-racist character of the Democratic surround in the 1950s, because that's a claim that strikes me as a little implausible, because I'm, as a scholar of kind of Black Mountain and things like that, it's known as an incredibly kind of misogynist and very white space itself. So I'd like to hear more about how these ideas had some kind of political dimension
I'd love
that
to
they
get
lost
at
in
that.
the 60s.
Yeah, let me get at that. And in fact, maybe the 60s is the wrong time. Maybe Black Mountain is more to the point as the moment when that disappears. I'll tell it in I think 2 pieces. On the first piece, I wanted to start with World War II. What we don't remember, certainly, and I didn't know, was that when Hitler came to power and launched his attack on Poland, it triggered a massive attack on American racism. So Ruth Benedict, the close friend, former teacher of Margaret Mead, wrote an essay called The Science and Politics of Race. It's a book, actually. It was a bestseller in the United States. And it's an attack on Nazi race theory that's attacking Nazi race theory with the goal of showing that we too are racists here in the United States and we need to change that. If we hope to be better than them and defeat them in war, we need to become anti-racist. That anti-racist charge is very loud in the 1940s. I mean, we tend to focus during World War II on the late desegregation of the army, right, which is an important story. We don't tend to acknowledge that there were people calling for desegregation and that they were writing bestsellers on that point in the 1940s. So the Benedict book would be the best starting point for that. The second piece I would use as my test case wouldn't be Black Mountain College, it would actually be the Family of Man. And I have a paper on this, which it's online, easy to get. But the Family of Man is the most widely seen photo exhibition of all time, almost certainly. It opened in '55 in the Museum of Modern Art. It's traveled around the world nonstop since 1955. It's currently permanently housed in a chateau in Luxembourg called the Chateau Clairvaux, or the Castle Clairvaux. The catalog was sold 8 million copies and has never been out of print since 1955. That was a show that featured people from around the world, 500 images, about equal people of color, people not of color, some in the US, some not. And so I show in the paper that a whole generation of scholars has made arguments about that show being a racist show, in fact, a quintessentially racist show of the Cold War. And they've said a number of things that are factually untrue, which sort of surprised me. One scholar who will go unnamed because, well, I wouldn't just go unnamed. A number of scholars will go unnamed, but it's in the paper. One scholar argued that there were no depictions of African Americans and white folks together. That's not true. There are pictures of folks holding hands being together. There's that African Americans are depicted as more impoverished and more beaten down than white Americans. That's not true. Most of the white Americans in there are from Appalachia, and they are every bit as beaten down. Edward Steichen, who did the work, was very careful about that. There are 2 features of that show that I think speak to the racism and the anti-racism issue. One is the careful array of depictions, so the images themselves featured people of all different colors. Now, if you look at them today, you say, wow, that's a National Geographic oppressive aesthetic, right? And I would agree with that. The people at the time who saw the show, most of whom were white, at least in the records, did not feel that way at all. On the contrary, they felt like they were identifying with Africans and African Americans in a brand new way. The second piece, I would argue, is that, and here I'm echoing Blake Stimson, a marvelous art critic at Davis, that what's important about the Family of Man is not only the individual images that are important, but rather the experience of walking in a surround. It's the space between the images, where you try to imagine yourself the member of a society that includes such an array of people. I think the incredible sales and the incredible attendance and there's a great number, there's a large number of records, people talking about this as a revelatory experience for them, makes it a pretty good counter case to the Black Mountain story. And that's where I hang my hat on that one. Thanks. Sorry for going long, but thanks. Yeah.
I'm wondering about, I was really intrigued by the discussion about market choice and sort of the transition from various forms of choice into sort of an economistic model. And I'm wondering and I was struck by like the Soviet exhibition was one that had, the free choice of products. I'm wondering, like, did that ever come into the sort of domestic exhibitions and sort of how you sort of trace that?
So yeah, it did. So the story on that is actually, it's actually a very explicit story. Again, it surprised me. In 1950, I'm getting the date wrong, 55 or 56, the Soviet Union had launched a campaign worldwide that they called the People's Communism. And they argued that communism brought a better life to Soviet citizens. They showed pictures of Soviets eating well, the great grain fields of Ukraine, tractors, and American government officials became very worried. They were very concerned. And they said, we've got to match that. And so they actually put together a group of advertising executives led by Theodore Ripley and a historian named David Potter, a very eminent American historian at Yale at that time. And they gathered together and they created something called the People's Capitalism Campaign. And it was actually a marketing campaign. You can see the ads for it at Collier's. They're spectacular. They built a huge, again, multimedia display in Grand Central Station in New York to promote this. And they took it overseas. And so the 1959 show was the epitome of the People's Capitalism Campaign, very explicitly done. So they began to morph, and very explicitly morph, consumer choice and the promulgation of democratic ideals overseas. I don't know the domestic side as well. I do know there was a big display in Manhattan in the Grand Central Station, and I know that there was a People's Capitalism Campaign that was advertised throughout American magazines. But that's all I know about what happened in the U.S. Yeah, great, and then I'll go over here again.
So I was curious how this sort of idea of like the democratic man or this emergent kind of reminded me a bit of the efforts and sort of Russian futurism to sort of create the proto-human and collaborate with artists to do that.
Yep.
So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the dialogue between those two and how they manifested differently?
Sure, yep. So I go into this in the book a lot, which is good because it's hard to talk out. So there are a number of traditions, visual traditions, that have multimedia affinities right before this one. And so I follow the social worlds really carefully to show how it's the Bauhaus people, not the constructivists, who are influential here. But I'm very aware that Russian constructivism is in view, and it influences Moholy-Nagy and is sort of around. Likewise, surrealism is around. And surrealism is very carefully seen as a non-democratic aesthetic in this period. It's really, particularly early on, early surrealism is really weird and creepy, and it does stuff to you. It's sort of doing to you a little bit what the movies do. And in fact, Abbie Rockefeller, who ran the Museum of Modern Art, wouldn't have it there for a while. And there's actually a separate gallery for surrealism. The constructivist story is a challenging one, as is, by the way, fascist multimedia, which is very prominent in the period. Russian constructivists influenced Moholy-Nagy, but Russian constructivist art, I argue in the book, looking at examples, like fascist art, fascist multimedia art, was designed very particularly to give you the experience of melting into the mass. So just a quick example. Russian constructivists, so I talk about a room that Elazinski does, and then I talk about a room that a fascist guy named Turini does in Italy. In both of those spaces, there are large crowd images. And they are just crowd images structured in such a way as to almost pull you into the crowd. But you can't see the faces of the people in the crowd. You can see the hands all moving together. You can see them like a fasci, like a bundle of sticks. So in The Road to Victory, there's also a crowd image of American soldiers marching in rows, in which the designers have carefully pulled out standalone images of individuals out of the crowd. So as you walk by, you look at the crowd, but you can't help but see that some are individuals. They're pictures of their families. It pops out like that. So there's a lot of work to distinguish the multimedia aesthetic here from those others. The other pseudo-fascist aesthetic here is Disney. I go into Disney here a lot in the book. Disney was also at the 1959 show. They had a totally different vision of how multimedia should work. They wanted multimedia. They built something called Circarama, which was a 360-degree field of vision show. But it was designed to take you over very explicitly. They said, we want it to be like a carnival ride, and we'll know it's working when everybody's swaying in time, which they actually observed in Moscow and were very happy about. They wanted you not thinking, and that was they had a very different vision of it, but they were there too. Thank you.
I love your historical archival research, and I want to question a bit your paralleling the moment when democratic surround sort of turns, I think you might say, more back to a fascistic.
At least managerial, yeah.
Right, not that all managerial stuff is fascistic.
There we go, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
But I want to question that because the experience of walking into a democratic surround environment, a multi-image exhibit experience, is one in which you have choice, but the choice is of reception. You choose what to receive the choices that we have in social media are not only of reception, but of production.
Yeah, great.
So I would even say that social media is much closer to something like a cybernetic loop, where feedback is possible, where maybe not negotiation is possible, and I would agree with that,
Right.
but at least the negotiation of meaning, as Stuart Hall would say, or
Yeah.
negotiation in the sense that you can hate on stuff as much as you want to. You can refuse it, reject it. You can also co-opt it, appropriate it, remix it. That it's not quite a parallel just between social media and this turn that you're talking about.
So I take your point, and I think it's well taken. Just for the sake of sort of thinking this out together, let me push back and play with it, because I actually, this is one of the things where I agree with both sides. You said one half of it, so I'm going to say the other half now, but not because I only believe that half. So another way to look at interactive social media is actually as a carefully presented opportunity for us to market ourselves back to the surrounding. And not at all as an attempt to actually let ourselves be authentically expressive in any way. And what's more, I think one of the other shifts that we see here is a shift to the expressive and the psychological as the mode of doing politics. You feel political when you're bonded to the nation in these spaces. Meantime, the government is actually doing stuff. And I've seen any number of Facebook petitions, other expressive activities online where we all express ourselves very authentically. We feel right there. And then we're done. And so I think that we are being asked to produce ourselves online in a variety of venues in terms that are already shaped by this space. And we're asked essentially to develop personal brands, to market ourselves. I mean, you're literally unintelligible on a dating site if you don't have images that are constructed in a certain recognizable way. This matching to menu feature is a very powerful one. And so too, I think, is something I'm coming to think of as disabling expression, right? Like where we can all express ourselves all day. And Mitch McConnell is still running the Senate. I find that horrifying. Okay, let me riff on this one more step farther. The Tea Party, ladies and gentlemen, has been kicking our butt. They've been kicking our butt because they haven't fallen for this fallacy. The Tea Party has been building institutions and parties out of churches and out of other institutions, building colleges to train people to do this stuff, and sending them to Washington to lobby and take over Congress. We have the 99%. They have Congress. Sorry, I get a little ranty on this point. I can go a lot deeper. Yes, I'm perfect.
It's kind of related to this, but when we are thinking about the normative ramification of your work, then I'm wondering whether or not even invoking the values of democracy is kind of subverting the whole project, because is it possible for us to have like a democratic polity without having like capitalist mode of production?
Right. That's a great question, and I don't know the answer. I confess, so this is going to have a confessional moment. I confess that I've really fallen in love with Cold War liberalism. In a lot of its manifestations. So let me try to defend it a little bit. So I was raised in a critical tradition. I was a child of the 60s. I lived through identity politics. That's how I was trained intellectually. I was raised on, I was like weaned on Foucault. Okay, so people sometimes say that my work is theoretical. I assure you I've read my theories. Okay. What I go back to and I see in the 40s that I admire so much is the really intense, serious, concerned effort to embrace difference and let it be different and be different together. And it's a view that I just didn't know existed. Margaret Mead wrote Coming of Age in Samoa. Well, then she wrote a series of articles, one of which is called What is a Date? Encouraging women to have premarital sex in the early 50s. I didn't know about that. Charles, I don't remember his last name, eminent philosopher. What is the open self? The open self is a kind of proto-hippie who works in a sexually diverse, racially diverse, hyper-tolerant environment. So they had a vision of a liberal America in which through political action, political choice, and aesthetic action, but not aesthetic action alone, they could build a world in which all would be welcome. One of my fears about our current turn away from politics and away from organized politics, especially on the left, is that we're getting in the habit of meeting with others like ourselves and losing the institutions through which we meet others unlike ourselves. And, churches, right? I'm a pretty secular guy, but I still go to Glide Memorial up in the city. Why? Because there my family and I can actually meet people who aren't at Stanford. And we can talk to them, we can do stuff with them in a kind of low-key, persistent way. So I don't know if we do democracy without capitalism. I just don't know. I'm actually much less bothered by capitalism than I am by kleptocracy.
and oligarchy. And I think those are the challenges. I think we're beginning to live a little bit like Russia, and I find that really scary at the governmental level. But I'm not necessarily anti-capitalist, and I'm starting to be a raging mid-century liberal. Yeah, it is.
Do you address in the book whether the Cold War liberals and Bauhaus, whether they were successful?
So I do, and again, another extraordinarily painful moment. I have to give a little context. My first book was about how Americans remember the Vietnam War, and I spent a long time, like a couple of years, working in a VA hospital, meeting with traumatized combat vets once or twice a week. And I have an acute sense of how far wrong we went in Vietnam, a sense that it's hard to explain in this room, right? Okay, so saying that, one of the most painful moments for me was when I started looking at the Center for International Studies at MIT in the early 60s, late 50s, partially CIA-funded center at which liberal leaders began gathering and taking the kinds of psychological interventions laid out here and imagining them now as military interventions. That's where McGeorge Bundy was, it's where Walt Rostow was, it's where the people who planned the Vietnam War were. And you can watch them in the archives of Senates actually moving from this pro-democratic mode that I'm outlining here, with the very best of intentions, to a place where they ultimately feel like it's important to bomb the rice paddies. And it's a horrible transformation. This too is one of the things that I take away both from the Vietnam work and this book, which is that people do just horrible things, but for the very best of reasons.
Well, but also, I'm thinking kind of earlier than that. You know, like Margaret Mead wanted young women to have sex before marriage. That did not happen in the 1950s.
Right,
so
yeah,
to what
that's
extent
fair.
were these intellectuals so far out of touch with
Right.
what was going on that they were promoting these theories and building these exhibitions, but that really didn't have the effect that they thought they were going to?
It's a great question, and I don't know the answer. I do know that the editors of magazines for mass circulation thought these people were sufficiently mainstream to print their work. So that's the only test I have, right? The great mass of Americans is in some sense mute from that period. I do know that the editors of Collier's and other kinds of a Red Book, relatively mainstream publications for ordinary folks, were publishing their work, and so they weren't out of touch in that sense. They may have been ineffectual, but I don't think they were that out of touch, actually.
Just want to follow up on this what you see as a kind of disjuncture between, say, Vietnam and this globalization. How can you so easily disentangle those when it seems like we are in the Cold War and these political questions are being negotiated in a totally different space that is not amenable to like the kinds of liberal politics that were available even in the Nature War period. You have Gary Will's book Bomb Powers really good on this, that the nuclear weapon the executive takes on a new political function that's not really manageable by Congress, and we also have the emergence of a whole new institution of government, the security state. And I mean, you can like the liberalism better than that, but how can we separate American imperialism or at least the Cold War global configuration from what you say is this possibility of a kind of pluralist American?
I think the first thing
And the reason I'll just say that is because we're in the same moment today.
Okay. Yeah, no, I buy that. Seen from 30,000 feet up, I don't know that we can. My own answer to that question, it's a methodological answer, is that if you get down closer to all those groups, they start to disaggregate, and they get much more conflictual. So we tend to think of the interwar period, meaning after World War II, before Vietnam, as a relatively singular unity. In fact, 45 to 48 is one of the most radical times in American history. I believe, and I have not been able to find this, so this may be a fiction, but I believe I read that there was a Gallup poll that suggested that in 1948, the majority of Americans were willing to turn over control of their armed forces to the United Nations. Now, that's an incredible state of being, and that's a very radical condition if we're willing to go to world federalism at that point. Even within the government units that I know, particularly the security state in the 40s and immediately thereafter, so as it gets built during World War II to fight, and then the first 5 to 10 years before Korea after, there's a much wider plurality of opinion than I would have ever guessed. And so I think that's the only thing I would say. I think that I'm not sure you can hold the liberal vision accountable for the bomb, but that's a...
No, I just think the way that you open it with Facebook is the problem of interaction in some sort of democratic liberal context, but not, extrajuridical killing and technology, which is probably more pertinent in some ways in terms of the political.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. Yeah, all I wanted to do there was just
show why the history mattered in the moment. But yes, it matters for other reasons too. Thank you. Yes, we'll talk more. Good, that's great. Thanks. I want to get over here, but I've been neglecting this side. Yeah, go for it.
I'm just interested if there are any specific contemporary artists that you're looking at who are dealing with these issues.
Yeah, there are actually. So there's a wonderful group. In fact, I'm wearing their hat tonight. Let me show the brand, okay? But so there's a group associated with Astra Taylor, who wrote the People's Platform, or Rebecca Economopoulos in New York, occupiers. They did something called the Natural History Museum, represented this work in New York at the Queens Museum. And they're all about trying to find and build multi-image source, multi-textual source environments to help people imagine democracy differently. And they're trying to build something like this. So they're real neat. I think something I should make clear is that when I do a book like this, right, it's like I moved to that country for 5 years. So you're talking to somebody who's been like overseas for a long time and actually doesn't know his America very well anymore, except in this period. And so I haven't followed art as much as I would otherwise have liked to. Yeah, and I have the green sweater in the back of the novel. Yeah.
I mean, the narrative we normally get around these things is around technology, and it's the cinemas will bring democracy, the radios will bring democracy, the telephone, whatever it is, and then now smartphones or whatever. And part of what I love about your work is it's so anti sort of that technological tautology kind of stuff. But at the same time, I'm kind of curious, how important is technology in this story?
Yeah, I'm trying to sort that out. And not in this piece, where the technologies are relatively static and not super changing. A lot of what I'm ruminating on right now is a kind of late 90s, early aughts project about the rise of the fantasy of the leveled society. And I do think it's a fantasy. It's a fantasy that serves members of certain classes a whole lot better than others. I'm one of them. In that, but that's where the rubber hits the road in terms of your question, because I might start talking about open source environments as closed to people who don't have the cultural capital to participate, which is true. But I also know that for the people who do participate there's a genuine experience of empowered collaboration with others. In my own case, right, I might bitch about copyright law, but boy, do I get a lot of that good music online now. I mean, it's incredible, right? Like all that African music, I always wondered where it was. It's one click away. And so that's a case where my kind of cultural orientation is getting challenged pretty hard. And I don't really have a good answer for that yet. I'm trying to figure that out. I will offer one other thought about the technology piece, which is that the other thing, and a couple of you have pointed to it, but nobody said it quite out loud. Each of those technologies that you pointed to has been integrated within a particular moment in the development of capitalism here in the US and abroad. And I think sometimes we who study media have not done enough to think about the broad social histories into which media are being integrated. But by the same token, I don't think the historians of those large histories have thought nearly enough about media. When I go talk to American historians, you ask them what was really great about the 20th century, they get all misty-eyed. They're always guys. They get all misty-eyed. I get the warm fuzzy feeling. No, television, cinema, all those lower class, working class technologies. Great. I've got two in the back there. I'll come back up. Yep, and the gray and then the green.
I'm wondering if you could talk about the sort of the idea of the distinguishing between sort of the Facebook and the sort of Twitter, these sort of online communities, and things like CES and the big expos that you talked about earlier, which seem to be this. There's a difference in privilege and access. And I'm wondering if you've given much thought as to sort of the difference between, like CES is a great example where you get these thousands of people, but they're usually wealthy, white males, whereas on Facebook, yeah, there's a privileged access, but you could get people going to a library and accessing Facebook on a computer. And I sort of wonder if you've done much thought into the difference.
I haven't thought too much about it. I'll ruminate on it now because I'll just take a shot at it. I think first off, we imagine Facebook as being more diverse than it probably is. I don't know the stats, but Esther Hargitay's work at Northwestern has been all about trying to figure out how diverse these things actually are. And I know that I believe that computer ownership in families in San Jose is actually relatively low. So I think that it may not be the case that people have access to those spaces. But even where they do, I think that there's a space and there's a space. So I think about my email list, right? My email list, I'm a professor at Stanford. My email list connects me to other people of like stage. My daughter's a college student. Her email list connects her to people of other like stage. Our worlds don't overlap much, but it's the same technology. There's nothing about the technology that grants her entree into my world, nor mine into hers, except when I spy on her Facebook. And by the same token, I mean, anybody can go to CES if they, spend the money to get there. And I agree that it's not cheap, but I think that there are structures of invitation across these worlds. Some are class-based, some are not. And it's too easy to dismiss these in particular as upper class only. Yeah. Thanks. No, it's you. Yes, great. Thanks.
I wonder how or if you see Gutai in Japan tying into this.
Say again?
I wonder how or if you see Gutai in Japan tying into this.
I don't know what Gutai is.
Oh, I'll email you.
Great. I love that. I don't know what it is.
It's like a movement that people very frequently equate as similar to Fluxus or in some ways action painting. But it comes from a completely different place.
Great,
but
great. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to talk to folks, I'm not here, but at another time, about Fluxus and the situationists and happenings and the possibility or impossibility of political change through those kinds of actions. It's something I think a lot about. Yeah, great.
In your analysis, you said that the left in the 40s and 50s had a conscious philosophy of media as a vehicle of political change, and whether or not it was helpful or not, I guess, the debate. And then in terms of our current situation and say the Tea Party, now would you, just in terms of your opinion, would you say, are they prevailing, or seem to be prevailing because they have a better theory of media, or is it simply just hard work of organizing and sort of fishing for an answer?
It's a great question.
Why the left is not making it? Does anybody have a good theory of media?
I will tell you my theory, and look forward to an essay soon coming to a house near you. This is something I've been just ripped about for a while. I think that the Tea Party did not make the mistake of thinking that media was the ground on which politics was to be fought out. I thought what they did was they built institutions. They took other institutions like the church really seriously, and they lobbied like crazy. So it's not just an energy application issue. It's an institution building issue. I think one of the legacies of the thing that I'm describing here for those of us on the left is the fantasy that freestanding individuals gathered together collectively and expressing their views will result in political change. Yeah, Occupy. I say that as both a fan and a critic of Occupy, and as someone who works with early occupiers now because I admire them. I've never been so heartbroken as to see that there's this fantasy that we will just occupy a space and present ourselves like children to our parents, and they will love us and change. Now, we got great symbolic value out of that. Changing the debate around the 99% is a very valuable thing to do. But have we changed Glass-Steagall? Have we changed the regulation of banks? Are any of the people who swindle us from those banks in jail? Have we pressured our leaders to put them in jail? What about the military? We're still at war. I didn't see anti-war activism in that space. I'm just incredibly angry about that. And I think we don't see that there in part because the expressive politics that we see there are the expressive politics of our class. They're the expressive politics of a faith in media that is misplaced. Well, that wasn't Buzzkill, wasn't it? All right. I'll tell you next time. I'll tell you what I really think. Yeah, go for it.
I have a question. I'm trying to think about it.
Go for it.
With regards to capitalism and democracy and activism, what do you think about the fact of, and also like art, like a movement forming where people are like, oh, in Silicon Valley, let's form a startup that's like democratic, cooperative.
Yep.
It's like activism. Let's build technology. Let's build a new social network. Let's build our own. Let's make our own shirts. Let's
You're not an undergraduate at my campus, are you?
What?
You're not an undergraduate at my campus, are you?
No, is that how it's like there?
Oh.
No, but I'm saying like rejecting venture capital though.
Okay. So for my guys, that would be silly, right? Like you just want.
Well, I said a cooperative kind of enterprise. So, you know, it's like worker owned.
So worker owned. Oh, okay. So in the language of the startup world that is knocking at my door every day, they would try to achieve everything that you just described, but through non-communist, non-socialist means. What they would describe of the problem of worker ownership is not worker ownership; it's a problem of share. The reason you don't want to take venture capital money is that dilutes your share in the eventual of the firm. A startup isn't cooperative in a lot of ways. It's, especially when it's small. It's 5 or 6 people, usually guys, built around an idea who very carefully work their tails off so as not to have to give up capital to other people. They only take the VC money when they absolutely have to. So you know, that's one of the perverse ironies of the Valley, is that in some ways, the cooperative ideal of communism in its perverseness is coming true in these hyper-macho programmer startups.
Yeah, but at the same time, like you're saying, the Tea Party movement is, you know, as far as like the politics of it, like, because I feel like that eventually gets diluted. Like people think like, oh, we're gonna change the world, but then it's just like, I mean, what if Facebook was more like there was like a section where it was just like activist politics. I mean, there's like your Facebook feed, it's like what your friends are posting there, but I feel like at the same time, like.
So just to note, your Facebook feed is monitored by Facebook and changed by Facebook. And there's a lot of controversy about that recently. So it's partly what your friends are posting, it's partly what Facebook wants you to see.
Yeah, like if Facebook was more like a news site, like with anchors.
So I think the key to making political change is slow, persistent organizing with people unlike yourself. Zeynep Tufekci at the University of North Carolina wrote a wonderful piece about why Tahrir Square failed. And she said one possibility is actually new media. New media allowed people to come together so quickly that they didn't have to do the hard work of getting to know each other along the way that a slow-moving social movement has to do. So when the batons came in, they didn't have the forms of solidarity that you build in that process. And I think that's also really interesting. How do you build solidarity over the long haul? I don't know. That's an interesting thing. Change the world in Silicon Valley means buy a product, make a product that sells really, really good. That's changing the world. It's my heart. Yes.
My question sort of touches on what you were talking about just now. As I was reading the book, this was my first exposure to the idea of the surround. I was thinking about it through the lens of today's media. If you're a Twitter user or whatever website of choice, you can sort of build your own surround. Oh, I like this person's thoughts. I'm going to put them in my feed and build this whole sort of thing from which I pick and choose. So why isn't that leading to sort of like flourishing political engagement and like-minded communities? You think it would?
You might. So the people of Herbert Bayer in the 40s, had he heard the story that you just told, would just be thrilled, right? Because you are doing the very thing that his Gestaltist politics said you should do. You should take media, surround yourself with the media that are meaningful to you, integrate them into your personal life, your stream, or whatever it is, and be that much whole on that account. I think they were wrong then about another piece, and I think the piece that wasn't in your story, that was more the Margaret Mead side of the Mead-Bayer combo, is the side about reaching out to those who are unlike yourself. You know, I would argue that the key to political action is finding some way to work persistently with people who are unlike yourself. And you can build an echo chamber, sure, but then you're echoing. How do you work with others who are not like you? And how do you find low-key projects where you have to put a little sweat equity in? So it's not just expressive, right? I mean, I retweet stuff all the time, right? Love it. You know, love that tweet, man. Great. You know, but have I gone and built houses in New Orleans? No. You know, have I joined a church group that goes out into the street and hands out food? No. You know, have I, well, whatever. But you get the idea, right? So I think the failure is not the failure of the medium. It's the failure is in our trust that the medium will do what there's really no way around doing in person, persistently, in institutions with people who are unlike ourselves. Is that a good stopping point?